Thought, we're back to Nach, and in Nach we're doing the book of Shoftim, and you'll recall that the book of Shoftim covers a more than 300-year period from the death of Yoshua until Shmuel Hanavi. Shmuel Hanavi is the last Shofet, because after him we have Shaul HaMelech, David HaMelech, and the like. And Shmuel Hanavi, however, wrote some other books as well. Shmuel Hanavi wrote Megillas Rus, and Shmuel Hanavi wrote the first part of the book of Shmuel until his own death. The book of Shmuel was finished after Shmuel's death by two other prophets, Nasan Hanavi and Gad, who's called HaChozeh, which means the seer, and the like. So I thought, again, I apologize for the digressions, but this is at least a digression that's bioso inyan, that since we are approaching Shavuos, and on Shavuos we read Megillas Rus, and Rus is in the book of Nach, and it was written by the last Shofet, so perhaps it's worthwhile to make a little bit of a segue to learn Megillas Rus. And Megillas Rus begins. The very first words of Megillas Rus, written by Shmuel Hanavi, Vayihi bimei shvot hashoftim. The story that I'm about to tell you occurred in the days that the judges judged. Now, if the purpose of that statement is to give you a chronological point at which the event happened, that's not a very good dating system. That's like saying, this event occurred over the past 350 years, in the day the judges judged. That doesn't tell you anything at all. So Chazal actually say that the purpose of the words Shavot HaShoftim is not to tell you it happened when the judges judged, because that would be a meaningless statement. That was an over 300-year period. But the way you translate it is, it was in the days when the judges were judged, meaning it's giving you a remez about the spiritual nature of society, that it was so bad that even the judges were being judged. Shvot HaShoftim, meaning if a judge told you, what's Rashi's, let me just find the Rashi here, 1 second. They don't have the Rashi in the art scroll. But what Rashi brings a Chazal that says, if a judge were to tell you, take the little piece of lint from your eye, you would say back to him, take away the beam that's in your eye. You're a lot worse than I am. So therefore, what the purpose of the narrative was, it was a time when Klal Yisrael was at a very low level, and even the Shoftim were not necessarily righteous. And we are given a certain story. Now, there are two issues you have to know about Megillas Rus generally. Number one, why did Shmuel write the story of Rus? Number two, why do we read Megillas Rus on Shavuos? Now, these are not the same question. Shmuel had certain reasons for writing Megillas Rus that have nothing to do with why we read it on Shavuos, right? These are two separate questions. What was Shmuel's tachlis in writing this book as part of the Kitzvei HaKadosh? So the short answer that's given is that shortly before Shmuel died, Shmuel wanted to legitimate the Malchus of David HaMelech. Remember that towards the end of Shmuel's life, the Jewish people asked for a king, and they had Shaul HaMelech, but Shaul sinned, and eventually David was anointed Melech. And before Shmuel died, he wanted to legitimate David HaMelech. Now, what's the problem? Why does David HaMelech need legitimation? So you have to know the halachic background. David HaMelech, as we see from the end of Megillas Rus itself, was a great-grandson of a Moabite convert whose name was Rus. Rus and Boaz had a son, Oved. Oved had a son, Yishai. Yishai had a son, David. So Boaz and Rus are the great-grandparents of David HaMelech. Rus is a convert from the nation of Moab. Now, you have to remember your Chumash. What is the origin of the nation of Ammon and Moab? So do you remember, Lot, Avram's nephew, is saved from Sodom with his family. His wife didn't make it because she turned around and she became a pillar of salt. And Lot's sons-in-law refused to go with them, so they died in Sodom. So Lot escaped with his 2 daughters. And they went to a cave in the mountains. And when the daughters see the desolation, they see everything up in smoke, they think the whole world is gone. They don't know. So they got their father drunk. The older daughter first got her father drunk, had intercourse with him, got pregnant, 9 months later had a baby. She called the baby Moav, which is a corruption of from my father, not the nicest of names. And then, the next night, the second daughter got her father drunk again, had relations with him, had a child 9 months later that she called Ammon, my nation. Marginally a little better. These 2 children became the ancestors of the nations that eventually became known as Ammon and Moab. Ammon and Moab. They were generated from incest. By the way, Chazal do tell us that the daughters of Lot were not promiscuous. Their intention was totally l'shem shamayim, because they literally thought, they even thought Avram was gone. They thought there were no human beings left on earth. Right? If you ever watch the Twilight Zones, right, you always know that people wake up and there's like nobody left in the world, type of thing. That's what they thought. They thought nobody was left. They acted l'shem shamayim. In fact, Rav Moshe Feinstein used to tell the story of a man in Russia who died a horrible death. He choked on his tongue, etc. But the man had told the story that he was punished by Hashem. I'm not sure how he was able to even communicate the story, because he made fun of Lot's daughters. He called them promiscuous, immoral people who committed incest with their father. And that night he had a dream of 2 radiant women whose face was shining with the glow of Kedusha. And they obviously looked righteous and holy and angelic. And he asked them who they were. And they said, we're Lot's daughters. And Hashem is going to punish you because of the Motzi Shemra, not Lashon Hara, Motzi Shemra that you said about us. And indeed, Kachabe, shortly thereafter, the man suffered a horrible death. Rav Moshe used to tell this story. It was someone he knew in Russia. But be it as it may, be aware of Ammon and Moab. Now, the Torah later says, in Parshas Kiseitze, Lo yavo Ammoni uMoavi b'kal Hashem. The Ammonite or the Moabite, whether from Ammon or Moab, may not enter the congregation of God, which is the Torah's way of saying they cannot marry into the Jewish people. Now, this doesn't mean if they didn't convert. If they didn't convert, they're Goyim. So what is the Torah telling me? Even if they convert, and they're Jewish, if they are Ammonites and Moabites, they cannot marry into the Jewish people. They can marry within themselves, but they cannot marry within the Jewish people. This is a lav. Lo yavo Ammoni uMoavi b'kal Hashem. But the Torah then gives a reason, which is interesting. Now, you might have thought, well, the reason is because they were created in incest. No, that's not the reason. That wouldn't have been the reason to disqualify them. The Torah gives another reason. Because when we were going to enter Eretz Yisrael, east of the Yarden, so we were going to pass through the land of Ammon and Moab. And we asked for safe passage, and they refused to let us go, so we had to circumvent that land. And we asked them for food and water, and we were offered to pay for it. And they refused to give us food and water, even for money. So the Torah says, Al Devar Asher Lo Kidmu Etchem Balechem Uvamayim. They did not offer you, even for money, food and water. B'derech b'tzeichem and Mitzrayim. Remember, they're east of the Jordan, right? So we were actually going to cut through their land to cross the Jordan. We didn't, and that's why we eventually fought Sichon and Og, north of Moab. And we conquered that territory, and that became the territory of the 2.5 tribes. But that's only because we were not allowed to go through. And Hashem said, if they don't let you go through, don't wage war against them. The Torah says, do not wage war against Ammon and Moab, because they are the descendants of Lot. So if they would have let us go through, we would have gone through. If they don't let us go through, we don't wage war. Unlike Sichon, where we did wage war. He was Amorite, Canaanite. So, the Torah gives two reasons why you're not allowed to marry an Ammonite or a Moabite. Reason number one is they did not give you food and water when you needed to pass through their land. And then it gives reason number two, that they hired Bilam, the king of Moab at least. Remember, Balak is the king of Moab. They hired Bilam ben Beor to curse you, destroy you, and Hashem changed Bilam's curse into a bracha. So it actually appears that the first reason they didn't give you food and water, that applies to Ammon and Moab. The second reason, they hired Bilam to curse you, that applies to Moab. I don't think Ammon was involved in that particular incident. So note very well that it's not the incest origin that is the disqualifier. It is the selfishness, the lack of compassion, and the lack of hakaras hatov, because after all, the ancestor of Ammon and Moab is Lot. And look at all that Avraham Avinu did for Lot. There should have been a sense of gratitude. In fact, many point out that the ikar condemnation of Ammon and Moab is the lack of hakaras hatov for the chesed that Avraham Avinu did for Lot. So, here's the big problem. Boaz, who was a gadol hador, married a Moabite convert whose name was Rus. The Torah prohibits marrying Moabite converts. And not only that, but to make it worse, the child of the Moabite convert is also a Moabite, because they come from Moabite. So that would passel Oved, that would passel Yishai, that would passel David. Now when I say passel, I don't mean that David wouldn't be Jewish. Even Rus was Jewish. A Moabite can convert. But it means that David was not eligible to marry into Klal Yisrael. Yishai was not eligible, even though he did get married, to marry into Klal Yisrael. Oved was not eligible to marry into Klal Yisrael. And if David was passel lavo b'kahal, David could not be a melech. So we actually find, according to Chazal, that David HaMelech had many, many enemies. And one of the accusations that was raised about David throughout his 40 years as king by his enemies was he is illegitimate. He is descended from Rus, the Moabite. And therefore the Torah says an Ammonite and a Moabite cannot be part of the congregation of God. David is tainted by the Moabite association. Therefore David's malchus is illegitimate. So what taka is the answer? Why isn't David illegitimate? The answer is there's a halachic loophole here, and that is Chazal understands that the Isser of the Moabite and the Ammonite convert is only a male Moabite or Ammonite convert. We darshan Ammoni v'lo Ammonis, Moavi v'lo Moavis. I'll explain why in a moment. Therefore, since Rus was a female Moabite convert, she was permitted to marry Boaz. And if she was permitted to marry Boaz, even her male children will not be tainted because there is no Moabite convert that's pasal level bikal. What's the svara for it? So the Gemara in Yevamos explains that the Torah condemns the Moabites because they did not give you food and water when you were traveling through the desert. Well, only a man could be expected to bring food and water to a foreign army. Women could not be expected to do that. Therefore, we can't fault the women for not giving you lechem umayim. And I would also add, who adin hiring Bilam. The hiring Bilam was the men did it, not the women. So, here is the underlying story. Shmuel is about to die. Shmuel died very young. Shmuel died at the age of 52. Hard to believe. Shmuel is Shakul Kamosha V'Aram. Died at 52. But the last thing Shmuel wants to do is give you a story that legitimates David HaMelech. And the way he does it is, he shows that even though Rus is a Moabite convert, the Gadol Hador, Boaz, married her. Boaz was the Gadol Hador. And therefore, this was a marriage that was approved at the highest possible level because of the halacha of Moavi v'lo Moavis. Therefore, it's legitimate. Therefore, it's kosher. Therefore, no aspersions can be cast on David HaMelech, because not only was Rus's conversion totally l'shem shamayim, which is true, although that wouldn't be relevant to the Moabite question, but she got married by the Gadol Hador. Therefore, it must be okay. So, the short answer is, therefore, Shmuel wanted to give us the story of the Moabite ancestry of David HaMelech to clarify the halachic principle that Rus was not pasal, lavo b'kahal, and therefore David HaMelech does not have a taint. Now that explains a fascinating thing. This actually explains why Shmuel deliberately had to omit one particular detail that Chazal give us that Shmuel doesn't tell us. That is, Boaz marries Rus and impregnates her. But he actually was with her only once. He died the next morning. Boaz's marriage to Rus lasted exactly one day. She visited him at night, but they didn't have relations. She married him the next day. That night, they consummated the marriage. Next morning, he died. Now, if you think about this, people might interpret this in negative ways. They might say, oh, Boaz comes along and marries a Moabite woman, claiming that because she's female, it's okay. But he drops dead the next day. So what are people going to say? You see, he shouldn't have done it. Now, that's not the pshat. The pshat was he should have died long before this. Hashem kept him alive to do this action. And then Hashem took him. But because it is so likely that this would have been misunderstood as a negative, so Shmuel was not mefarsein this particular. I'm sorry, someone has questions?
So was it not obvious that Rus married Boaz and that was David's lineage? Did they just have like a vague rumor that, he comes from Moabite, so we don't know who were his grandparents?
Yeah, apparently, again, people spread rumors, and therefore the facts were not known to everybody exactly. And also people weren't aware of Boaz's stature, so Shmuel needed to clarify that as well. So essentially, he wants to say that this was not an affair, this was not a clandestine thing, this was a wedding that was public. We're going to see that many halachas are learned out. The Gadol Hador married her, therefore one should not cast any aspersions. Yeah?
So since this Russia was made after the marriage, right? Does this mean that Boaz has the authority to decide himself or without having the Sanhedrin or the marriage?
No. So you have to understand the way this worked. Obviously, we're not talking about this was a new drasha. This was a drasha that goes all the way back to Halachic Legitimacy Sinai. The only thing is, David's enemy, there are many people who were not so learned, and David's enemies spread the halacha in an inaccurate way to discredit David. Boaz was the one who was mefarsem this halacha, which was already known by Talmidei Chachamim, and Shmuel wanted to further be mefarsem, because you'll see it's an ugly accusation. In fact, after Shmuel died, the accusation resurfaced over and over again, meaning this was something that followed David his entire life. Now keep in mind that Mashiach is, of course, descended from David, which means Mashiach is descended from Rus, the Moabite convert. So if you were to cast aspersions on David, you would be casting aspersions on Mashiach, right? Which would be pretty serious stuff. Okay, so that's why Shmuel wrote the story of Rus. Now, why do we read Rus on Shavuos is a totally different set of reasons. The makor of reading, Megillas Esther, we know, is a takana from the Anshe Knesset Hagdola that's essentially as old as Megillas Esther itself. Megillas Esther itself refers to reading the Megillah on Purim. But reading the other Megillos came a little later. And the source is in Maseches Sofrim, which mentions that we read Rus on Shavuos. Now, as you may remember, with respect in Chutz La'aretz, with respect to all the Megillas except Megillas Esther, we don't read from a klaf in most places. We read from a chumash, and we don't recite a bracha. And among some Hasidim, it's not even read publicly. Each yachid reads it. You sit in the shul and just read it from the siddur. In Eretz Yisrael, following the minhag of the Gra, we actually read all the Megillas from a klaf. And not only that, we also recite a bracha. The bracha of Al Mikra Megillah, in Yerushalayim at least, is not only recited on Megillas Esther, but on Eicha, Shir HaShirim, Koheles, and Rus. Now the two things are probably connected, meaning since we're reading on a klaf, we recite a bracha. If you're reading from a chumash, you don't recite a bracha and the like. Rus in Yerushalayim, in Eretz Yisrael, has a little bit of a hardship because we only have one day of Shavuos, so you stayed up all night, right? In Chutz La'aretz, Rus is read the second day of Shavuos, so the davening is, when you're real tired, is a little shorter. You don't have Megillas Rus, but in Eretz Yisrael, you got Megillas Rus, and you also have Yizkar, right? So davening is longer on the first day of Shavuos in Eretz Yisrael than it is in Chutz La'aretz. So why do we read Rus on Shavuos? So there are a lot of different reasons. One reason is that Shavuos is said to be the yahrzeit of David HaMelech. It is the day that David HaMelech died, and we want to remember David HaMelech. And we remember David HaMelech by reading the beautiful story, because Rus is actually a very beautiful story, of how the marriage of this Sadekes to Boaz produced Oved, Yishai, David. So one is the connection to David HaMelech. The other is the idea that Rus represents the exemplar of a person who embraces the Torah with purity of motivation. Remember, Rus actually came from royalty. Her father was a king of Moab, Eglon, the king of Moab. I'll talk a little bit about him in a moment. And Rus left a life of luxury and embraced a life of poverty and deprivation in order to serve Hashem. Now, Shavuos is the day of Matan Torah. And Matan Torah is actually described by Chazal as a mass conversion event. The Jewish people converted. In fact, the halachas of Gerus, what must a ger do to become Jewish? What must a non-Jew do to become Jewish? We actually derive from what the Jews did in receiving the Torah. When the Jews left Mitzrayim, the men had a bris. That's how we know a ger has to have a bris. When the Jews left Mitzrayim, or before Matan Torah, they went to the mikveh, or they went to a body of water. As the Torah says, they immersed themselves in water. So Mila, Tevila, and the third step in conversion is accepting the mitzvos on yourself. What did the Jewish people do at Matan Torah? They said, Naseh v'nishma. We unconditionally accept the Torah. So the three steps for male conversion is bris, mikveh, kabbalas mitzvos. How do we know that? Matan Torah. Matan Torah is a conversion of Klal Yisrael. So if we want to understand what is the proper kavana of a convert, we look at Rus Hamoaviyah, her mesiras nefesh, her devotion, her generosity, her kindness, because we're doing a gerus in Matan Torah. You know, it's interesting though, Maharal of Prague, the Maharal's first sefer was a perush he wrote on Rashi that's called the Gur Aryeh. That's the earliest sefer of the Maharal, which is a perush on Rashi. Where there are many. There's more than 300 perushim on Rashi and Chumash. 300. The most famous, the most authoritative is Rabbi Eliyahu Mizrahi, called the Ram, and the second is often the Gur Aryeh, the Maharal, and the commentary in the Megillas Gedolos, the Sifsei Chachamim, which is a very useful perush, is actually a likut of Mizrahi, Gur Aryeh, Levush, other perushim Rashi. In fact, that's why it's called Sifsei Chachamim, the lips of the sages. Who are the sages? All of the commentaries on Rashi that preceded him. But anyway, in the Gur Aryeh, the Maharal raises the following question. We have a rule that says, Ger sheniskayer, when a person converts, Kekatan shenolad dami, he is like a newborn baby. Now that has some very radical implications that you might not realize at first. Consider the following. A brother and sister convert. They are treated as newly created entities. That actually means, under Torah law, the brother is allowed to marry the sister because they're not related to each other. Under Torah law. Father and daughter convert. Don't quote me on this. Under Torah law, father and daughter are allowed to marry. Mother and son convert. Under Torah law, they could marry. They're newly created entities. Now granted, midrabanan it's forbidden. So it is forbidden. And the reason it's forbidden is because since when they were non-Jews, there was an incest prohibition under the 7 commandments of Noah. If it was usher when they were goyim, and now it's mutter after conversion, it looks like they're going from a higher level of kedusha to a lower level of kedusha. So, chas v'shalom, we don't want people to think, becoming a Jew is great because it's a lower level of kedusha than we were goyim. So in order that it shouldn't be banu mikdusha chamura l'kedusha kala, and also marasayin is another reason, it's going to be forbidden. But the Oraisa it's mutter. So frek de Maharal, if that's the case, then at the time of Matan Torah, all of us became converts. Then, at least for that first generation, there should be no prohibition of incest. There should be no prohibition of brother-sister, father-daughter, mother-son. Is it yitachem? Now, once the kids are born later, so they're born Jews, so the brothers and the sisters, like after conversion, are going to be related to each other. But the generation that experienced Matan Torah, nobody's related to each other. So is it yitachem that there is no incest prohibition? Now, I'll tell you the truth. The Meshech Chochmah, who does not quote the Gur Aryeh, actually says, Eino Chinami. The Meshech Chochmah actually says the generation of Matan Torah had no incest prohibitions. So it's what they say sometimes. They sometimes say, one commentary's reducto ad absurdum becomes the other commentary's ein hachinami. Meaning to say, Maral said, it's impossible. Of course there's an incest prohibition. Meshech Chochmah said, there isn't. Okay. But the Gur Aryeh, who assumes there must be, does ask the kasha, why would there be an incest prohibition? So Maral says, a fascinating chiddush. He says, although it's true that Matan Torah was a conversion, yeah, it was a conversion, but it was not a conversion that severed familial relationships. It was not a conversion that had the quality of Gershon Iskayer Kikatan Shanayla Dami. And that's why brother, sister, mother, son, father, daughter remained intact. Because the Maral explains that the rule of Gershon Iskayer Kikatan Shanayla Dami only applies to voluntary conversions. When you voluntarily decide to become Jewish, that erases your past. Now, normally there's no such thing as an involuntary conversion. But there's one case in history where a conversion was actually involuntary, and that's the conversion of Matan Torah, where God held the mountain over our heads and said, convert or else. So Maral is Mechadesh that since the Geirus of Matan Torah had an element of coercion, you don't apply the rule that it severs family relationships. And that's why there was an incest prohibition there, which would not be true on a Doraisa level for other conversions. We'll come back to this because obviously the issue of coercion at Matan Torah raises a whole bunch of problems. If we were forced into it, why would it be binding on us? It's a matter of coercion. Of course, the Gemara says, well, originally until Purim, we had the excuse. At the time of Purim, we accepted the Torah willingly. Of course, I'm wondering if you could then ask the question, well, if that's the case, then at the time of Purim, we shouldn't have incest prohibitions. But okay, apparently that was not Purim was not a conversion. The conversion dates back to Matan Torah, and at that point, it was an involuntary conversion. Okay. So, as I say, why do we read Rus on Shavuos? Number one, the yahrzeit of David HaMelech. It's also his birthday, just like Moshe Rabbeinu. Zion Adar, day of birth, day of death, also for David HaMelech. Second reason, Matan Torah is conversion, and Rus demonstrates a conversion l'shem shamayim. And reason number three is that Rus is an exemplar of Gemilas Chesed, the kindness that she showed to her mother-in-law. And we need to know on Shavuos that the Torah can only be acquired by Chesed. Without Chesed, one cannot have Torah. In fact, what did the Brisker Rav use? Brisker Rav used, the Brisker Rav, Rav Yitzchak Soloveitchik, was the son of Rav Chaim Soloveitchik, the Rav of Brisk. And Rav Chaim Soloveitchik was considered to be the greatest Gaon at a time of many, many Gaonim. He's known for his amkus, his depth, his unbelievable understanding of Torah. And yet, on his kever, the words that are written is Ish HaChesed. And they say there are two great Gedolim that the world underestimated. Everyone looked at the Chafetz Chaim as tzaddik, and they didn't realize his gaonus. And everyone looked at Rav Chaim Soloveitchik as Gaon, and they didn't realize his tzidkus. But the emes is Rav Chaim was a greater tzaddik than he was even a Gaon. And the Chafetz Chaim was a greater Gaon than he was even a tzaddik. And the like. So Rav Chaim said to the brisker, so Rav Chaim was doing all sorts of chesed. In fact, Rav Chaim's house was hefker. I mean, Rav Chaim's house was literally hefker. And he said more than hefker, he said. Because the Rishus HaRabim that's hefker, if you would be sleeping in the Rishus HaRabim, they have the right to kick you out. Rav Chaim, people would walk in, they would take his bed, they would take his svarim out to learn in the Beis Medrash. I mean, there's a Ma'aseh that he was once writing something with a pen, and somebody just came and took away his pen. I mean, he's holding the pen. They said, they took it out of his hand. And women who gave birth to out-of-wedlock kids, apparently even in Brisk, that was a problem. They would leave their kids at Rav Chaim's house. He as Rebbetzin would raise Yisayimim. And when there was a fire in Brisk, and a lot of the poor homes were burnt, they were flimsy, he slept in the, and the rich people were not in such a rush to rebuild the poor homes. Rav Chaim slept in the street. He says he is not going to sleep in his house till the houses of the poor are built. Interestingly, around 2 years after the fire that wiped out the house of the poor, there was another fire in Brisk that wiped out the house of the rich. I mean, it's interesting that apparently there was some onish because the wealthy people were not taking care of the aniyim in the right way. But Rav Chaim said, he who closes the Gemara to help another Yid has an open Gemara. And he who opens the Gemara not to help another Yid has a closed Gemara. I open my Gemara not to help you, my Gemara is closed. I close my Gemara to help you, my Gemara is open. Torah exists only when there's chesed. And therefore Rus, which is the story of chesed, is what we read in preparation as part of Matan Torah. Okay, so the point to keep in mind is these are two different questions and they have different answers. Why did Shmuel write Megillas Rus? Largely to legitimate the yichus of David HaMelech in order to protect David HaMelech from all the attacks on the legitimacy of his malchus. Why do we read Rus on Shavuos, yard side of David HaMelech, to teach us about sincere conversion and to understand that the Torah requires a connection to chesed. Without chesed, there cannot be Torah. And that's why the Torah is called Torah's Chesed. Torah's Chesed. Because Chesed is the kli, the vessel that allows us to retain our Torah. Okay? So that's kind of a little bit of an introduction regarding Megillas Rus, and then we'll go right and we'll look at the different psukim. So again, Megillas Rus, everyone can have their own text. You can take a chumash, and the back of the chumash is the 5 Megillos, and it's only 4 prakim, so I'm not going to be able to read it mamish pasuk by pasuk by pasuk, but we'll cover a number of psukim inside and get the basic storyline as well. Okay?
Thank you for listening to this Ohr Somayach production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.